is there a playbook that people can follow for their configuration in the cloud?
The challenge with the cloud is, always on availability groups has the replication built into to the technology. So the challenge in the cloud, when you're talking about not in the cloud, anytime you're talking about a multi data center type solution, the challenge comes into making sure your data is available across all the different data centers. So the always-on availability groups has some functionality built into it to replicate that data between the different instances of SQL Server. So I could do that synchronously within the same data center. Or when we're talking about the cloud, synchronous can be used within the same region, but between different availability zones. And by using the synchronous replication, you can also enable that high availability failover clustering. The high availability automatic failover and recovery, which is required for high availability. Now, when you start talking about SQL Server failover cluster instances, traditionally that is a single data center only type solution because it would require some sort of shared storage device. So whether it's your fiber channel SAN, your iSCSI, or even in the later versions of SQL Server, you can leverage SMB3 shares, but all that data normally resides in a single data center. So stretch clusters or multi-site clusters require some sort of replication technology that is not generally offered by the application or the operating system. Now, there is a solution that was introduced in Windows Server 2016 called Storage Spaces Direct, which eliminates the need to have a shared storage device and instead allows you to leverage just local attached storage, and it takes care of the replication and creates kind of a virtual storage bus layer that kind of mimics the SAN. But even that solution, you have to be careful if you're considering that using that in the cloud. That still is a single data center solution, so it's not even supported if you want to span availability zones. So, and this holds true for Azure when you're going between availability zones, or AWS availability zones, or even Google zones. Google's interesting in that zones are not very well defined. And if you do some research, you'll find that sometimes different zones will be different data centers, but other times maybe not. So you have to be very careful that if you're using S2D in any of those environments, that your nodes all reside in the same data center. The challenge with that is then you don't get the 4 nines of availability with your infrastructure. So with, for instance, if you want to do that in Azure, you would leverage something called fault domains, which instead of different data centers, they're typically, you think of it like different racks in the data center that have some, resiliency, and there's no single point of failure between those racks. But if you're not leveraging the availability zones, Microsoft's only giving you 99.95% SLA. So that typically falls below the bar of high availability. So you have to look at the solutions. There are new solutions that are coming out, some SMB3 options, and you have to be very careful when you look at those as well. So in AWS, you have the FSx service, which offers a SMB3 share, and Azure Files can also be leveraged to have your backend storage be an SMB3 share. But if you look at the SLA for those storage offerings, they're typically 3 nines, 99.9%. So you've gone through the entire process of making your virtual machines highly available, 4 nines of availability, but then you just put your storage on something that's 3 nines. So effectively your cluster is back to 3 nines of availability. So why did you go through the whole process of clustering your instances when your storage is only 3 nines? So you really have to look very closely at all the, at every part of your cluster to make sure that you have, those 4 nines you're striving for in availability. Now, not every application needs 4 nines, right? So you might have some database SQL Server instances that are not quite as, business critical. So, single instance, 3 nines of availability with a good backup solution, a good disaster recovery solution might be sufficient if your recovery time objective is hours, recovery point objective is, minutes. Then, there's solutions out there. So not every instance needs the 4 nines, but if you do have that business critical instance that needs the 4 nines, you have to be very careful at what you're looking at. So S2D is one option for the SQL Server Failover cluster instance. The SMB3 share is another option for those instances. And then there's third-party storage replication solutions that will give you this synchronous replication and integration with failover clustering, which overcomes some of the limitations around the S2D because it's not limited to a single data center, and also will allow you to, doesn't box you into the 3 nines of the SMB solution. So some of those third-party solutions can sometimes be better options for deploying failover cluster instances. So it really comes down to, do I want to deploy availability groups versus do I want to deploy failover cluster instances? And there's benefits to each. Availability groups gives you gives you high availability and gives you some stuff like readable secondaries, which can be beneficial in some scenarios. But it also comes with the price of SQL Server Enterprise Edition. And, the alternative, the SQL Server Failover Cluster instances, you can run with the SQL Server Standard Edition, but you don't get the readable secondaries. However, it does, it replicates the entire instance. So things like your agent jobs, your logins, your passwords, everything gets replicated. Some of that stuff gets left behind with the availability groups. So it really depends on your requirements when you're considering, which way to go for availability in the cloud.